Welcome back. I'm Philippa Thomas. Last year, I was here, sitting on this stage, when we were talking about the dawn of a new Arab world. And we're back to look at what's happened, what remains to be done. It's obviously going to be a busy session. You can participate in this hall, and for those of you who are watching us live streaming at oslofreedomforum.com, in the hall, we have two volunteers ready to take questions as we go through our debate. If you're outside, you can tweet us at Oslo Freedom Forum. Forum is FRM, otherwise it's all one word, Oslo Freedom Forum, or email questions at oslofreedomforum.com. So, though we have a lot to get through and we have some very powerful speakers, this is supposed to be interactive and we will be listening to what you say as well. So, today we were talking last year about the dawn of a new Arab world, and today we're past the euphoria, aren't we? We have got past the heady drama of the overthrowing of leaders in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Libya, and we are still witnessing the brutal beating of protesters in Bahrain, blood on the streets in Syria. So we're looking in the cold light of day at which freedoms have been gained, which struggles remain, and what lessons we've learned. And with the panelists also, we're going to try to look beyond the conventional wisdom and perhaps try to tell you something you didn't know about what's happening across the Arab world. You do know there's no single Arab story. There have been elections in Morocco and Tunisia. There's an outburst of political energy right now in Libya, where elections are due to take place next month. But in Bahrain, the Grand Prix rolled on regardless of state violence, and the headlines in Sudan and South Sudan right now revolve around oil and the potential for conflict. So, in some of our states there is more hope, in others more tension, more fear. And during this panel debate, as I said, I want you to hear about stories behind the headlines. We want you to hear about the distractions that our speakers feel you should ignore when trying to work out what's really happening on the ground. We want to talk about the role of women. We want to talk about the relationship between Islam and democracy. All this, and we want to bring in your questions and reactions too. So I think it's time to go on to our panelists. Let them introduce themselves and their countries. Ahmed, if you want to come up first. We have voices for you from Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, Bahrain, Sudan. We're going to begin with Ahmed Benchemsi, who founded Morocco's two best-selling weekly magazines. And for that, he was sued, he was harassed, he was interrogated, he was threatened with death. His voice is as clear as ever, and currently he's a visiting scholar at Stanford University's program on Arab reform and democracy. And we're going to go to start our positions on the sofa and listen first to Ahmed.
Hello, everybody. I'm glad to be here. Well, we shall maybe begin with a quick update on the situation in Morocco. Last year, when we were talking about Morocco, the February 20 movement had just started. Hundreds of thousands of protesters has taken the streets, demanding democracy and a constitutional change. Well, unlike other Arab countries like Libya or Syria, where the government, the regime, brutally suppressed the protesters and shoot people in the streets, in Morocco, no such thing happened. The king said, "What, you want a constitutional change? Sure, okay. What do you want? Constitutional monarchy, an independent judiciary, freedom of speech? You got it." Well, that was a smart move, because actually the protesters were destabilized. Suddenly the question was, what's the point of going on protesting? So the numbers of protesters dwindled over the months, and 3 months later, the constitutional draft written by a commission appointed by the king was made public, and it was, in one word, a mock, a sham. I mean, behind the beautiful wording, the monarchy was still as absolute as ever. The king was still controlling the government, the judiciary, the security apparatus. His cronies were still puppeting government agencies, ransacking the economy, all of that beyond any form of accountability. And the constitution, of course, passed, and the West applauded. Hillary Clinton said that Morocco's reform were a model for other Arab countries, obviously because we're not shooting people in the street, so, well, maybe it just doesn't take not shooting people in the street to be a perfect democracy, obviously. But still, that worked in the view of the West. So the protesters, people tried to continue protesting, but the numbers dwindled again. And finally, after that, a few months later, parliamentary elections happened. Islamists won, which was a first. There was an interesting distraction because, number one, it's the first time the Islamists ever accessed the government in Morocco. And then the prime minister, Mr. Benchemsi, is a media-friendly figure. He says a lot of jokes. He's very funny. And by the way, these are Islamists. Ooh, it's scary. So media are kept busy with that. But the real story behind this distraction is that the monarchy is still as absolute as it ever was, and that's the real story. And real democratic voices that still ask for a fair and democratic distribution of powers in Morocco are either stifled, marginalized, or put in prison. That's the real story. There are tons of stories to mention. Just one that is very important is the case of 24-year-old rapper Muad al-Haqad, who is in jail while we speak for the second time. Who cares? Well, I think we all should.
Ahmed, thank you. Lina, come and join us on the stage. We're going to gradually fill up our sofa before we begin debate. Lina Ben Mhenni is a Tunisian girl. The title of the blog where she told it as she saw it, risking her safety to document the protests and the crackdowns during Tunisia's mass protests. She is still taking risks today because she believes the revolution in Tunisia is not over. Lina, in your words.
Hello, everybody. Firstly, I want to thank the Oslo Freedom Forum organizers for inviting me again. Last year, I stood here and I expressed both happiness and hopes after the ousting of a dictator from my country. But I also expressed my fears to see another dictatorship starting there. Now I continue on traveling all around the world to talk about the situation in my country. And each time I'm shocked when I hear people saying that everything is okay in Tunisia, that a new era of democracy started in my country. It's true that we had fair, transparent elections of a constituent assembly, but the performance of the newly elected government is weak and mediocre. Instead of dealing with the real problems that pushed Tunisians to take to the streets, to face tear gas, to face live ammunition, and today they are diverting our attention through useless and fake debates about identity and religion. Signs of dictatorship are everywhere in Tunisia. There are attacks on freedom of speech and freedom of press. There is violence against peaceful demonstrators, including the wounded of the revolution, who were beaten many times because they were demonstrating, because they didn't have the appropriate health care. There is no transitional justice, and there is an acceptance of external interference from some countries pretending to defend human rights, to defend democracy and freedom. I'll mention two countries, the United States and Qatar. They are highly interfering in our internal affairs. And so finally, I want to say that I'm still hopeful for my country because Tunisians are aware of what's going on, because our civil society is more and more powerful and trying to act whenever they have to. Finally, I want to express my support to all the countries fighting for their freedoms, especially the Arab countries and especially Syria and Bahrain, where crimes against humanity are going on.
Lina, thank you. Ghazi, come and join us. Ghazi Gheblawi, a Libyan author, poet, blogger, physician. He helped to gather information for the world as Libya went through its long period of turmoil and upheaval. He tells me the business of reconstructing Libya is full of challenges. It's difficult, but we should also know that it's very exciting. Ghazi.
Thank you. A year ago, while we were here gathering in Oslo, Libya was under many threats. One of them is that we had a very big debate, political debate all over the world about the essence of intervention in conflicts in the world. And the second one was that people were killed on the streets on a daily basis in urban centers in Libya, and the revolution at the time wasn't really clear where it was going towards. Since then, now we are in a different position, I think, in Libya in many ways. We have established a new government that is in transition. Many things have improved. And as I say in an optimistic way, that we are progressing steadily towards a better situation than we had before a year ago. We are now, before a year ago, we were debating lots of things, especially in terms of preventing the killings and also trying to have a solution for transition. Now we are talking about in Libya, there is, all the debates are political. There are flourishing civil society. Also, there is rather a gush of new media. We cannot say it is independent or free, but it is, compared to what a year ago, was much better. And also there is now the prospect of an election coming next month, which is the first one since 2 generations. The 2 generations of Libyans have never expressed their thoughts or their will through elections, and that's in many ways progress. But we are facing many challenges. The main challenge is reconstructing a new country. The dictatorship under 4 decades tried to make the country as much as possible under its wing. So when the dictatorship went, there was no more a state. So we are building a new state with all the problems that we have with the new state. We are facing insecurity in some parts, conflicts in some parts that are been breeding there because of the old regime. And also we are trying to establish a strong government. The government that is now in power is so weak that people are exploiting it. People are trying as much as possible. New centers of power are developing that are using violence to get to what they want from the government, and getting also positions. And that's one of the main challenges. But I think the main challenge is to build a society based not on the outcomes of elections. It's based on the democratic values where civil society is free and independent. And the second thing, we have a free and independent media that will protect the rights of the people to express their thoughts freely, and also to challenge and the right to resist any kind of dictatorship that comes through the ballot box. Thank you.
Ghazi, thank you. Amir Ahmad Nasr is the Sudanese thinker. He's one of the most thoughtful and funny writers on the Arab uprisings and their implications. He tells me to look beyond political maneuvering to the psychology of the region, of the people, and that's a thought to which we will return. But I'd like Amir to tell us how he sees it from Sudan, and how the dynamics of the Arab Spring have affected life at home. Amir.
Good to be back after 1 year. So to begin, first I'd like to speak as a Sudanese. As a Sudanese, I must say it's frustrating to see the media repeatedly painting what's happening in Sudan as a conflict between Arabs and Africans, Muslims and Christians, North and South. In some ways, that is true. But there is a lot more complexity, as we all know. It's always more complex than what it's portrayed. And about 6-7 months ago, protests were really picking up throughout Sudan, very underreported. You had protests in eastern Sudan, which is Afro-Arab and Arab, and you had protests within Khartoum, and the movement Girifna was doing a really great job mobilizing people. These protests were not huge, they were not massive, but what they show and what they really indicate is that this narrative of this, Arab versus Africans, Muslims versus Christians, it's false. It's Sudanese people versus a dictatorship. It's as simple as that, because the government in Khartoum, Omar al-Bashir, he doesn't care whether you're an Arab or an African or a Christian or a Muslim, or If you're against him, if you speak up against the government, you get stepped on with the shoe. It's as simple as that. So that needs to be recognized. And it's frustrating to see that the coverage has been oversimplified. Right now, I am still optimistic, but I must admit I'm low on optimism given what's happening between the North and the South, because there is a real risk of war breaking out. Hopefully that won't happen. And we will talk more as we proceed during the panel. The second thing I want to express is my frustration, not as a Sudanese, but as a North African Arab or an Afro-Arab. The frustration has been also with the media narrative that, ooh, the Islamists are taking over, they're winning, it's doom and gloom, and we are toot. Insert your favorite word in there. Again, they are winning through the ballot box. And if we see things through the perspective of politics, through the lens of politics, it doesn't look very nice and pretty right now. But if we see things through the lens of psychology and from the perspective of biology, the situation is very different. Psychologically, we went from 40 years of stagnation, okay, victimhood, apathy, boo-hoo, I'm the victim, ooh, we're oppressed, we're hopeless, to self-entitlement, self-empowerment, and people demanding their rights on the streets. That's a huge psychological shift. And it's still there, and it's still strong, and it's still continuing. Will it manifest itself in democratic, institutions and healthy functioning governments? Big question mark. Biology, why is it important? Because this is an indisputable fact. The old dinosaurs currently ruling the Arab world, from Saudi Arabia all the way to Morocco, those dinosaurs in the next 10 years, they're going to be bye-bye, right? And guess who's going to come gradually and take over? Okay, the younger generation. More open-minded, more globalized, internet savvy, and even within the Muslim Brotherhood youth, they're very frustrated with their leadership. They might be religious, conservative, which is fine, which is all good. It's a Muslim country. We have to expect Muslim countries to be religious by their nature. But the youth in the Muslim Brotherhood is very frustrated with their leadership because they recognize that the leadership is authoritarian and abusive. So what is happening is a shift, from victimhood and apathy, a psychological shift, and also people are less and less tolerant of authoritarianism. Again, we will talk more as we proceed, but biology and psychology, they show a very different perspective, and it's an optimistic perspective.
Amir, thank you. Maryam al-Khawaja is a strong, fierce voice for the Bahrain Center for Human Rights. As of this week, she's its acting president, since its president has been detained. And in her state today, her father is on his 90th day of hunger strike. Her sister is also in detention. She sees an escalation of repression, which she will speak to us about. But first, she wants to deliver words to you that she has never delivered in public before.
Thank you, Philippa. It's, of course, a pleasure to be back here this year, and I would like to thank the Oslo Freedom Forum organizers. I wrote this poem about 2 weeks ago when my father went missing from his hospital room in the military hospital. And today he's gone missing again. We haven't heard from him since last Friday. The poem is called Live Interview. How does it feel? I'm okay. But he's your father. How does it feel? You look at me, searching for tears. I look you in the eyes and I respond. I cannot answer your question. Your camera will malfunction. Your mic will lose sound. How does it feel? I feel cheated. Cheated of a dream of freedom. Cheated. Former chief of Secret Service running for president in Egypt. Cheated. Protesters beaten on the streets after a new government in Tunisia. Cheated. One-man election, former man's government in Yemen. Cheated. Friends making empty promises of savior in Syria. Cheated. Petrol more valuable than blood in Bahrain. Drown out their screams with the roar of an engine. We're trying to help you. We'll send 30 people as intervention. Silence. Babies crying, mothers weeping, sirens blaring, wives in mourning. Silence. Was that the sound of pellets entering a Bahraini's heart? Or a sniper's bullet aimed at a Syrian's head? Silence. Are those the children of Gaza, looking at the sky, waiting for the bombs. I hear nothing but silence, alone in a room, thousands of miles away. I missed you by a minute, Dad. I called, but the officer had cut the line. It would have been the first time I talked to you in months. It might have been the last time I hear your voice. You want to know how I feel? I feel angry. Angry at governments that preach freedom and democracy, then support authoritarian regimes to feed their greed. Angry at governments who say they condemn the violations, but refuse to do anything to stop them from happening. And no, you will not see me cry for my father, a man who fears not death, because in death he finds freedom. A man who fears not tyranny, because they can break his body, but not his soul. I cry not for my father, for he puts a smile on my face. The tears you see in my eyes are for you. Sorry, ma'am, we lost the connection.
Maryam, thank you. Thank you all. A reminder that you can join our conversation by tweeting to Oslo Freedom Forum, that finishes FRM. You can use the hashtag OFF12. I know many of you are doing so already. We're also taking emails, and even when we leave the stage, we know the conversation will continue. But we're going to begin our general talk with more of the reality check that the panelists began by giving you. I want to look first at what looks like the good news story in Morocco, in Tunisia. We've had elections. Now, Ahmed, you spoke about a mind game. It's not all it seems. It could be said, you're being idealistic. You're getting there. You've had a start.
What, elections? We already had elections in Morocco. That's no news. And elections have been free in Morocco.
But now the Prime Minister is not decided by the King. The Prime Minister is decided by whoever comes out with most seats in the elections. Would you not say there has been some progress, even though it falls short?
Okay, let me tell you about that. The new constitution, you're right, provides that the Prime Minister now, the King still picks the Prime Minister, but he has to pick him, or her for that matter, among the political party that arrives first in parliamentary election. But what does it mean to arrive first? If you look at the election engineering in Morocco, no party can win more than a quarter of the parliament tops. Like the PJD, the legal Islamist party, it won 27% and it was hailed as a historic victory. Which means that to access 51%, which is the score that you need to form a governing coalition that will not fall anytime, you need to coalesce with other parties. Guess what? All of them are puppets of the monarchy. So they are governing, but with a gun over their head all the time. So Morocco, you always have to go beyond appearances. Let me tell you about this constitution that was voted and actually saluted as a major democratic breakthrough. Well, first thing that you have to have in mind is that it was passed with a margin of 98.5%, which is hilarious if you think about it. I mean, no question on earth would have such a margin of approval. I mean, if you ask people, are they for I don't know, peace and love, you would have more than 1.5% who would say, actually, I'm for war and hate. So this is obviously a sham. Let me give you, there is a constitutional article that I love. It's Article 36, and it illustrates very well how tricky the Moroccan monarchy is and the constitution is. It says, listen well, the traffic in influence and privileges, it has to do with the economy, deals with the economy. So the traffic in influence and privileges, the abuse of dominant position and monopoly, and all other practices contrary to the principles of free competition and fair dealing in economic relations are punished by the law, which sounds great until you find out that there is no law actually punishing that, and that the King of Morocco is the first businessman in the country, and that he's the first banker, that is the first farmer, is the first landowner. He holds the first chain of supermarkets in the country. He's the first sugar producer, steel producer, milk producer, yogurt producer, steel producer, you name it. And this is despite this wonderful article of the Constitution. So
Lina,
it's filled with tricks like that.
Let's bring in your experience, because also Tunisia, where the Arab uprisings began, where you have had elections, where we'll talk about this more later, but where the Islamists say, we are dedicated to multi-party democracy. But what's your experience been as you've been going around reporting, filming on the streets?
Well, as I said, it's true that we had free and transparent elections, and these were elections for a constituent assembly who is supposed to draft a new constitution for Tunisia. Well, now, after 6 months of their elections, these people didn't even draft one line in the election. And this is a shame. Well, and as I said, almost nothing changed in Tunisia.
And do you feel the outside world isn't watching this, that Tunisia has ticked the box in a lot of minds?
I don't see that the world is keeping on following what's going on in Tunisia. As I said, I see that all the people think that everything is okay in Tunisia, and even the foreign press moved to other cases, to other problems all around the world. They forgot Tunisia. Well, to go back to the first question, this elected government and people who are going to write our constitution have always the same excuse. Give us time and let us work. But, you know, the wounded of the revolution cannot wait. We lost 2 people after January 14th because they didn't get the appropriate health care. Yesterday, a young man died because he set his body on fire. 4 days ago, another young man set his body on fire. And the government is ignoring those people. People who took to the street didn't ask for an Islamist state or whatever. They asked for employment. They asked for the punishment of the people who killed our martyrs. But even those killers are still free. They even had promotions. So,
Lina, let's move on. Given what you said, Ghazi, I was struck when you addressed the audience a few minutes ago. You said building a new society shouldn't depend on the outcome of elections. Don't look at that. It's about the values behind it. One could say you're in a better position of having no permanent government. You have a transitional government. You're rebuilding a state. What issues is that throwing up that maybe we in the outside world are not seeing?
Well, it looks very, I mean, lots of issues. Sometimes lots of people go into Libya and see on the microscopic level. It's the same thing in lots of countries, even Tunisia and Morocco. And when you look at it microscopically, there is plenty of problems. The problems that might stem from daily problems with people while they're dealing with their lives, until, I mean, things that the government, how it deals with the daily lives of the country. But microscopically, when you look at it from a bigger perspective, it looks that it is progressing towards a better results. But the truth is that the government in Libya is a very weak situation, that it can be exploited easily by elements of the revolutionaries, what you call, to get, for example, privileges, whether they are money, because we have plenty of money. We don't have. This is the difference between other countries. In Libya, we are maybe privileged enough to have that money. We have lots of money that can be spent, but the government is inefficient and incompetent to do its job to get that money into projects for rebuilding, reconstructing the country, and most of it is being spent in a very inefficient way, in an incompetent way, towards giving money to people without giving any incentives.
So with a lot at stake, a lot of money out there, and oil in the picture, it's pretty combustible.
Yes, it is, and it is already happening, because lots of people now competing for that money, also in positions of power, and the government is not giving any. It's trying to postpone the problems into another government, because they don't have the authority, because they are not legitimate in a ways. They are not elected from the people. They are self-appointed, so they are not active. They don't have any kind of the will, political will to do anything that is tangible on the ground.
Amir, as you look at what has happened and at the uprisings that have been, you said you felt that Sudan turned away from this. Is Libya held up as an example, or do people in government say, beware chaos? Look at what's happened elsewhere. Is there an appeal to stability?
Definitely. I mean, many analysts have looked at the situation in Sudan. I've looked at it. There is a real concern. I mean, here's the thing. If an uprising does take place in Sudan, it's definitely not going to be like Tunisia and Egypt. There will be no Tahrir moment. Best case scenario will be something like Yemen, snipers, some killings, factions in the government breaking up, lots of tensions. Worst case scenario like Libya. And people do bring that up. And in fact, the opposition leader of the Ummah party in Sudan, a very prominent opposition party, you know, he always says, he's like, listen, we need to try dialogue. We need to try some different mechanisms, because Sudan is too fragile right now for us to have an uprising. You know, he does have a point, but at the same time, I mean, can you really negotiate and have a dialogue with a government that's this violent and this appalling and reprehensible? You know, so you're stuck in a very difficult situation. So long story short, no, Libya is not really held up as an example. People are worried that the situation could get that bad, and it could. And for the older generation, as I said last year, Sudan has had 2 uprisings in the past, in '69 and in '85. And you know, the older generation looks back and says, okay, we had 2 uprisings, what changed? So they're very reluctant, but the younger generation, we're the ones with the most to gain and also the most to lose, and so it's very different for us. Yeah, but that's really it.
We'll come to Maryam. I also want to say that if any of you feel that you want to reflect on other countries, on kind of resonances, differences, want to point up other factors, do come in. Maryam, what do you think is the strategy of the government of Bahrain right now?
Well, to a large part, they like to do the test and run system, which is basically they'll do whatever they need to do, the action, and then wait to see what the international response to it is. Now, if there isn't too much of an international response, they'll keep doing it. And so when they saw that using violence on the streets, shooting pellets at people, tear gassing people in their homes every single night for more than a year now, they saw that there wasn't too much of an international response to that. They still do it. It's happening on a daily basis in Bahrain. For example, when it comes to right now, we have the 3 most well-known human rights activists who are known internationally are in prison in Bahrain today. And the question is, why does the Bahraini government think they can get away with that, putting human rights activists in prison? And it's because when they arrested them, there wasn't too much of a reaction. And the fact of the matter is, unless we see concrete actions as consequences, when it comes to Bahrain, nothing is going to change. If anything, it's going to get much, much worse.
We are seeing international reaction in Syria, but not on the scale we saw in Libya. Clearly, every state is different.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in Bahrain, it's quite the opposite of Libya. In Libya, you got an intervention to help the people against the government. In Bahrain, you had GCC forces, Gulf Cooperation Council forces, go into Bahrain and help the government against the people. And they are still in Bahrain today. And one of the scariest thoughts for any person in Bahrain is the fact that there's a rumor going around now that next week they're going to announce a union between Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. And I don't think it gets scarier than that as to what consequences that will have.
So as we talk about outside powers, Saudi Arabia is one of the key ones. Iran is raised in debate as well. And when we were talking before about what we were going to put to the audience, you also said to me, let's get some of the distractions up there, the things that are used to make people stop worrying about our plight. And I wonder if any of you want to speak to that, the distractions.
I said last year that for way too long, the dictators in the Arab world have been using the Palestinian-Israeli conflict as a weapon of mass distraction, to distract people away from the local issues and, to focus on Israel and Palestine. Now I think more and more people are focusing on Palestine for the sake of Palestine, and the distraction of Israel is not working anymore. We saw Bashar al-Assad sending people to the Golan Heights to stir up tensions between Israel, and some of them reportedly got shot and killed, and even that didn't work. The uprising still continued, and the propaganda didn't work. Oh, it's the Zionists, oh, it's the Jews. Same thing with Iran. Oh, it's the Iranians, you know, here and there. The whole distraction of Iran is not working, and even Al-Qaeda, we saw Gaddafi.
Yeah.
You know, you can speak about that.
Yeah, Al-Qaeda, I mean, they still use those distractions even in Syria. I mean, they're trying as much as possible to portray that these conflicts didn't happen because people wanted to have a new change, but the intervention was from the beginning from outside world. And I think in the case of Libya, most of the revolutions that continued after the intervention in Libya, they use the same notion. If you want to prevent the chaos in Libya, then you need to stop talking about intervention in the countries. But in the same time, they accept intervention from other countries in the cases in Libya and also in Tunisia, accepting intervention from the backstage by other countries that seem to be benign.
Yeah, if I could just add to that very quickly. I mean, one of the things that we've seen specifically in Bahrain is name-calling or labeling. And the Bahraini government has done a very good job at this. You know, back in the days, the first thing they labeled all of the opposition with was that they were all Nazi-socialists. And then it became that they were all communists. And then suddenly they were all Iranian agents. And now they call them terrorists as well as Iranian agents. And so what these Arab governments love to do is to see what is perceived as an international threat at that point, and then label all of the opposition in their country with that label and try to garner support internationally to, you know, fight them.
Ahmed, do you see that narrative from Morocco?
Well, Morocco is quite a particular situation because the distraction is inside the system. It's the government, actually. Everyone is focusing on the Islamist government as if it was what mattered in Morocco. Oh, they are Islamists. Are they going to implement, I don't know, Islamist policies? And everyone is about that. Some are pro, some are against. But this is a distraction because the real power still relies in the hand of the monarchy. Absolute power in the hands of the monarchy that still controls everything. And at the end of the day, the Islamist government is bending to the royal palace almost as much as all its predecessors. So we don't need external distractions in Morocco. We create our internal ones. And then this is why the Moroccan royal palace actually is pretty much experienced in terms of creating smoke screens here and there to give the impression of change, but actually continuing as in an absolute fashion as ever.
Lina, just to pick up with Lina, I want to hear from you something about who is trying to get the message out about what's really happening. And is it getting more difficult because there are distractions? One of the distractions is the euro in crisis, the global economy in crisis. You know, the headlines have moved on. Is it harder to get people to look?
Yes, with all what is going on all around the world, it's hard to keep people's attention on what's going on in Tunisia. But there are internal distractions, as it is the case in Morocco, for example. As I said earlier, instead of solving the real problems of the country, which are mainly economic and social, the government is trying to divert our attention to such subjects as religion and identity, Islam, of course. And of course, they have their media for propaganda to present the situation in Tunisia as a good situation, to present Tunisia as a new democracy. Well, some cyber activist bloggers are trying to talk about the real situation in Tunisia, but this is not easy. They are powerful, they have money, and they are the government. They are ruling, they have power.
It's also the case that for many citizens, bread, jobs, stability are needs that are right there. Democracy and human rights, less so. So it's up to you to keep selling your priorities.
I think the biggest risk is not really this whole notion of, oh, the Islamists are taking over, the liberals need to win in that whole, paradigm. It's really the economic situation. I think that's the biggest threat to the Arab uprisings, and it can cause more frustration, and the next wave could be ugly if the situation doesn't get fixed. I remember I was in Tunisia for the 3rd Arab Bloggers Summit, where some of us met. And I arrived at the airport and I got in the taxi and I was very excited. I'm like, yes, finally I'm in Tunisia. I get to experience the country for the first time. And I asked the driver, so how do you feel after what happened? He says, well, as a Tunisian, I'm very proud of my country, proud of what my people did. But, before the revolution, it was already difficult to put food on the table. And now after the revolution, there are less tourists. And, I can't pay the bills and life is getting more difficult. And I thought about it, I'm like, yeah, this person doesn't really care about the constitution and the state of, is Islam the religion. I mean, they don't bother about such things. The main focus is, I want to feed my family, full stop.
Some questions are coming in. One says, only secular leaders have fallen. The monarchies still stand. Is this a coincidence? I see you begin to smile, Maryam.
Well, yeah, I think it has a lot to do with geopolitical importance and economic importance. For Bahrain specifically, even with the question of what people are fighting for, I think in Bahrain it's different in the sense that there are people from all aspects of life participating in this revolution. And you have some of the richest people in the country who are now standing in opposition of the government and demanding things like human rights and dignity. The word dignity has become one of the biggest goals for people in Bahrain, and it's more about that than it is about economics at the moment. But yeah, I think the fact that they're still standing does have a lot to do with it, because today we're looking at a situation where you have countries like the United States, like the United Kingdom, France, and others who are very publicly criticizing Russia for selling arms to Syria, but they're doing the exact same thing in Bahrain. And so today, those countries are to Bahrain what Russia is to Syria.
Double standards. Ahmed, you wanted to speak?
The question, the way the question was shaped, secular leaders only were overthrown while monarchies are still there. Actually, I don't see exactly this wording as accurate, because monarchies are not necessarily unsecular, and secular leaders are not necessarily not religious. Like, let's just remember that in the constitutions of the Arab world, Islam is the religion of the state almost everywhere. So this is not exactly the right categorization. But that was just a point in passing. Back to the economic point, you're perfectly right. All these political tricks can be used to fool the media and to stifle and marginalize the activists, but still the population, the everyday man and the everyday woman still have the same economic difficulties as ever. And in Morocco specifically, even though all this constitutional engineering and mock-up was extremely brilliant in terms of political trickery, there has been more than 30 spontaneous riots all throughout the country for various reasons, like lack of proper housing, lack of jobs, economic difficulties of all sorts. And now somehow, and this is a consequence of what happened last year in terms of global Arab Spring and its local forum in Morocco, people feel empowered, because whatever tricky the constitution was, what happened is that the people felt that the monarchy has somehow bended to the will of the people. And this feeling somehow empowered the people. So now, for every grievance that used to happen before, people take to the streets, and sometimes in quite a chaotic fashion. The problem is that there is no organized grassroots structure that can channel that and make it an effective democratic demand or program. That's the problem for now.
So you talk about the everyday man and the everyday woman, and I want to ask where women have a stronger voice today as a result of the Arab uprisings.
Perhaps Mona should have been up here with us.
I'm sure that Mona's in the audience, or she'll be logged in. Hello. Yes, you knew that would get to you. Mona El-Tahawi, who asked, why do they hate us? And talked about the Islamist hatred of women burning brightly across the region. I'm aware we could have hours of debate on this issue alone, but I just want to come back to that thought. Lina, in Tunisia, for example, women doctors, women lawyers were out there, still are out there, presumably, playing their part. But is it easier or harder?
Of course, Tunisia is known as being an avant-gardist country when it comes to
more empowered.
To women's rights. While Tunisian women are well educated, they are conscious and aware of their rights. And even if we heard some of the new leaders of our country giving discourses in which they talked about polygamy, about the amendment of some of the articles of the Code of Personal Status guaranteeing the rights of women in Tunisia, I see that women are fighting against these changes. Women are taken to the streets whenever such discourse is pronounced. When we observe the peaceful demonstrations going on in Tunisia to denounce attacks on freedoms, on women's rights, or on freedom of speech, women are always in the forefront of the demonstrations. And this gives me hope. I have total confidence in Tunisian women. They won't let anyone attack or steal their freedoms and their rights.
What about those who aren't on the front lines and are in the shadows? I know in Morocco, for example, we've had the issue of young girls who have been raped, then forced to marry. There has been outrage, there have been headlines around the world. How much is that felt as an outrage across society?
Well, I don't exactly link that to the ripple effect of the Arab Spring, but still there is some connection. The connection is, again, that people feel empowered and that scandals that used to happen before are not now, are now more mediatized and more, paid attention to as it was earlier. This case you're referring to, the case of 16 years old Amina Filali, what happened is that she was raped and then she was forced by a judge to marry her rapist as a way to settle the situation, because this is supposed in the very, very traditional mentality that, by marrying your rapist, you just erase the rape and there is no problem anymore and society is safe, which is absolutely scandalous. What happened, and there is a law actually saying that in Morocco. What happened this time is that feminist activists just stood up and said, no, this is not normal. We should fight against that because something is happening since last year in the Arab world. We are speaking for our rights. This is part of our rights, and it's a very symbolic right. And we were spoken about Muna al-Tahawi. By the way, I loved her article. And she mentioned Amina Filali, and she said that she is the Bouazizi of the women's cause. I totally subscribe to this point of view. Go, Muna.
Amir.
Again, I mean, it goes back to what I opened with, which is there's a real shift, psychological shift from victimhood and apathy and fear to self-empowerment and self-entitlement. Yes, there are no democratic institutions, and yes, it's still going to be a long, painful journey. But the psychological empowerment is so thrilling to so many people, and it's still there. It might not be in the news, you might not have some cool, heroic stories, the euphoria might not be there anymore, but that sentiment is still very powerful, and believe me, it's only bound to grow. Why? Because, if you look at the example of America around the 1950s, right? Forget politics for a while. Let's just look at households and look at families. Okay, back in those days, when the father says something in a typical household, the father says something, gives an order, the wife listens, the kids listen. There is no debate within a traditional home, right? But that changed. Same thing here in Europe. Well, the Arab world is experiencing that right now. Again, leave politics. Just look at the household. This is an indisputable fact. I mean, I look at my little cousins who are like 5 and 6 years old when my uncle talks to them, and they reply back defiantly. And I'm like, damn, I couldn't do that last time. What's going on here? And even my mom, she's like, oh my God, kids these days, what's wrong with them? I'm like, Arab uprisings, baby, that's what's wrong with them.
But I'm going to put it to you that there's a naivety there as well, which is born of your idealism, and that where we are seeing Islamist parties doing well in elections, where we are seeing, I want to check this with you, Ghazi, the leader of the interim government lifting the restrictions on polygamy. There is a backlash.
There's aggression, yes. Sometimes,
I mean, Ghazi, I'll just hear from you.
Yeah, can I answer that? I think there is a phasing in the Arab uprising. Phase one is what started last year. It's actually uniting all the social and political forces with one aim, taking down the dictator. It has succeeded in Tunisia. It has somehow succeeded in Egypt, but maybe there is another dictator system behind the dictator that fall. It succeeded in Libya. It didn't succeed in Bahrain, didn't succeed in Morocco, didn't succeed in many other countries. But anyway, that's phase one, putting all social forces together with one aim. But then, when this happens, Like, take Tunisia. What happened is that there was immediately a huge electoral victory of the Islamists. Somehow, same thing happened in Morocco and Egypt, obviously, and I believe that this is going to happen everywhere else. Why? I don't see this as a backlash. I just see this as a normal consequence of the fact that Islamists are the only organized political force that has been formed and that exists in the Arab world. So it is absolutely normal that they win in elections because they have no credible opponents. So this is phase two. And to end with this phase, what is going to happen when Islamists take over here and there is that at last the real debate will be open in the Arab world. You know, democracy is about having a debate defining what the society is and what it should be. This debate has been stifled under dictatorships because there was no debate at all whatsoever, and that's what makes dictatorships. But now, in the country where there are no dictatorships anymore, and in the country where there will be no dictatorships anymore, we will not be able to avoid the central debate, which is what society do you want in a future? Do you want a Muslim, an Islamic society, an Islamist, actually, society, where the rule of law is derived from the Sharia, broadly, I mean, there are details, but let's put this image broadly, or do we want a secular society with laws that actually would allow us to be what we already are, which is people who have freedom of thought and who have various ideas and thinking of what religious practices should be?
Go to Gaza.
That's phase two.
That debate is taking place vehemently in Libya right now, with people registering for the elections.
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things.
What kind of shape of society do you think is emerging? Or, you know, what place do women have?
Well, there was a debate, I think, about 6 months ago when the election law was drafted and was passed by the National Transition Council, whether we give a quota for women's presentation in the Constitutional Assembly, and there was there was a mixed feeling that some women expressed that they don't want any quota because they need to they want to assert their strength through the work from civil society, from the grassroots, not from top, giving women's places in parliament without just because they are women. Just because they think that this should be earned, not given by the authority. But at the end, they figured out that they will give it. They did the same model like in Tunisia, where each list of parties should have 50% women representatives and 50% men representatives, so they have at least 20% representation in the parliament. But is that the issue? Is that the main thing? Because you have quite lovely, amazing, colorful laws in the Arab world protecting women from lots of abuses, but at the same time they are not empowered. They're not even enacted. And this is the case also in Libya. This is the case also in other countries, because the society itself needs to change, needs to shift. And that's, I think, the debate that is opened up because the dictatorship has fallen.
And meanwhile, we still see sexual violence as a weapon, as Mona knows in our audience, and of course, as you see in Bahrain in the tactics that he used.
Yes, definitely. I mean, today in prison we have 3 girls who were protesting, demanding the release of al-Khawaja, Ma'souma Sayyid, Maryam al-Khazaz, and Zainab al-Musawi. Maryam al-Khazaz is under 18 years old. And now they're being held in custody for 45 days just because they stood on the streets holding a picture of someone who's detained. Zainab al-Khawaja, of course, who's internationally known and is my sister. She has 5 cases against her in court right now. Things like obstructing traffic while protesting. And then, of course, my personal heroes in Bahrain are the girls who go out every day wearing a gas mask and carrying a first aid kit to treat the protesters who still don't have access to hospitals and who get injured on the streets. And those, for me, are the real heroes. The women, the mothers, who go out and try to free the little boys, the 14 and 15-year-old boys who are getting held and beaten by the riot police, and they actually go and try to pull them away from the riot police, and they get beaten themselves sometimes. And I think those are, the real heroes of these revolutions.
Lina, you told me when you were saying that it's still difficult now, that you told me it's still difficult now and that you are sometimes threatened sexually as well.
Yes, let me say that it's much more hard right now. Well, in the past the enemy was one enemy, was clear. Now the situation is too different. cyber activists, politicians, dissident politicians, human rights defenders who dare to criticize this newly elected government are all the time receiving threats. It can go to death threats, rape threats, but it also went to physical violence. On April the 9th, we celebrated the memory of our martyrs, and many people were savagely beaten by the police, but by people working for the government. The communist political leader Ahmed Benchemsi called them a Nahda militia, and I confirm his words. I was present, and those people were coordinating with the police. We know them, and they were very violent, and some bloggers have got the arms or legs broken. Others, I don't know, were really beaten, and this is a shame after January 14th. Journalists were targeted too, and I can't understand this. I can't tolerate this.
So we're looking, aren't we, at to put it mildly, the patchy results of the Arab Spring uprisings. And one question that's come from the audience for your collective wisdom is this: what are the prospects for a spring of any kind in countries like Qatar and Saudi Arabia, monarchies more absolute than the former regimes of Morocco, Libya, Tunisia, Egypt?
Anytime soon, I mean, my perspective, not going to happen. But again, through the lens of biology, at least, I mean, the Al Saud family, the top heads right now, they're all in their 70s, 80s. So in the next 10 years, I mean, may they rest in peace, basically. And after that, they've got so many kids because they marry so many different wives, and there is real tension within the royal family now over who's going to take over. Now it's easy, there's a clear line of succession, but then after that, what happens? So that, I think, will lead to some form of instability. It's just unsustainable. Then, of course, the question is, will the Wahhabi clergy step in, fill the vacuum? Are the modern Saudis, the ones who are, more and more empowered, are they going to step in? What will that look like? That's, of course, there's no way you can predict it. But again, the royal family, it's increasingly going to become unstable. I think that's inevitable.
I think it's the same question when these uprisings started before in 2010. Nobody predicted this is going to happen, especially in countries that where lots of people thought people were so oppressed that their will to change was so shattered. Like in countries like in Libya, lots of people thought this guy. The guy thought he's invincible. That he thought at the last moment of his life, he thought that something is wrong, is happening. He's not gonna be facing the reality. And the same thing, I think these regimes are not facing the reality, and they're putting themselves inside the bubble and trying as much as possible to shift the problems that are internal to external areas, especially in countries that have influence and the money to do it. And so they try as much as possible to protect themselves in buffer zones and hijack other revolutions.
I think it has two aspects to it. There's the internal aspect and the external aspect. Internally, it's very difficult right now because you need a popular movement to get any kind of change. Like, for example, in Saudi Arabia, nobody talks about the people, the protesters who were killed in the eastern province. Sure. I think most people don't even know that it happened. And then there's also people like Mohammed al-Jadi, who's a human rights lawyer in Saudi Arabia who's been on hunger strike since the 21st of February. And again, nobody talks about these issues. In Qatar, they care about human rights everywhere in the world as long as it's not inside Qatar,
and
right?
also
so
free
they're
media.
willing,
Exactly,
they're willing to fight for this anywhere in the world as long as it doesn't concern Qatar. It doesn't concern the internal policies in Qatar. And then externally, when we're looking at the situation with Bahrain, the monarchies in the Gulf, and this is a problem that we've had for a long time, is that the West looks at the Gulf as if only the monarchies exist. There are no populations there, and that's how they deal with it. So when you're looking at a situation where the king's son, Nasr bin Hamad in Bahrain, who has testimonies, we've collected testimonies of torture, where he's been involved directly in committing torture, going to London as the head of the Olympics Committee for Bahrain in this summer, or where the Crown Prince can freely visit Washington, D.C. as if it's business as usual, of course the other monarchies don't feel threatened.
When I said to you all, which power should we be taking notice of, you all said Qatar.
Yeah, Qatar is a case study of its own. I mean, they did something extremely smart, the Al Thani royal family. They preempted the whole process by having a very aggressive diplomacy, being involved in whatever country was ready to be involved with them, namely Tunisia, certainly
Libya.
Probably Libya, and
Even
other
Sudan.
Arab countries, and also having an extremely powerful influence tool, which is Al Jazeera, which is a channel that fueled the uprisings all over the Arab world, but of course didn't ever say a word about Qatar or about the countries where there were some strategic links with Qatar, like Bahrain and the Gulf countries.
Even Sudan, I have to say that Al Arabic Al Jazeera have some issues with it, but Al Jazeera English, generally I love Al Jazeera English, but on Sudan they're biased just like Bahrain. They don't cover the protests enough, they don't show the anti-government perspective, and Qatar has been recently pouring billions into Sudan to try and stabilize the economy because it's so weak right now.
Let's throw another factor into the mix, a question that's come in for you all. Will sanctions by foreign countries work in a situation like Bahrain, or do they end up hurting the wrong people?
Well, I mean, in Bahrain specifically, that's what we're asking for. As human rights activists, we've seen enough violations. It's become obvious. I mean, first of all, we need to see the bare minimum. We don't even have consistent statements of condemnation against the violations, not even that, let alone a special session in the Human Rights Council for the UN.
And you contrast this with Syria, as you watch what's happening in Syria.
And the thing is that we're at a point right now where there needs to be a serious discussion about economic sanctions against the regime in Bahrain. Because the Bahraini regime, as long as there is no real consequence for their actions, they have no incentive to change. Why should they change anything?
But then you look at, say, in Tunisia and Morocco, very real issue with unemployed graduates on the streets, jobs, a huge issue. The revolution in Tunisia sparked by the vegetable seller who can't make a living, support his family. And sanctions can hurt the people.
Sanctions for what? For having unemployed people?
No,
doesn't make sense.
we don't
Sanctions
need to
against
have
political
sanctions.
systems.
We already have sanctions. Tourists are abandoning us. We already have
So they might as well be
sanctions.
effective.
We need foreign people to help us by promoting tourism in our country, by investing in our country. We don't need sanctions. No.
You know what we need? Is a sharper view from the Western government, because actually what happens is that there is always another country that serves as an alibi and a justification for condoning the abuses that happened in the first country. Morocco, that's the perfect case of it, because whenever you say, hi, look, the constitution is tricky, the pro-democracy protesters are fought against and put in jail, and they will say, hey, look at Syria, right? I mean, the American ambassador in Morocco told me that. He said, well, you should be happy.
The UK, I think foreign minister said the same thing about Bahrain, where he said, Bahrain is not Syria.
Look at
and
North
Bahrain,
Korea.
there are reforms, and we support those reforms.
The same thing that the dictator said, that every country is different from the other one.
Yeah, and they use, every country uses another country to justify its abuses. So I think the major breakthrough would be that Western diplomacies consider every country case per case. But is this consistent with their interests in terms of economic interests and oil and stuff like that? I'm not really sure.
And not just that.
We can write about it, but that's the most we can do.
I've expressed my optimism. I think authoritarianism is dying a slow, gruesome death. Okay, authoritarianism will be gone eventually. Will it be replaced by liberal secular democracy, or what kind of democracy? Debatable, big question mark. So I'm confident about that. But the economic, aspect, that is the real concern for me in the long run. I mean, Eastern Europe, it had its George Soros, it had its billionaires in the United States, and back then the United States was in a good position to really help prop up the situation. Yeah. But the Arab uprising, unfortunately, it happened during a time when the whole world is suffering economically. So we don't have our George Soros, not that we want him, he can come, but by virtue of being Jewish, we'll have some conspiracy theories there for sure.
Oh, absolutely, they will flow in immediately.
In Libya, you have your George Soros. Ghazi, you were saying to me in Libya, There are think tanks coming in, there are advisors, there are people training.
Qataris are doing that.
I mean, they're lucky. They're
And
billions
you
of
said,
dollars.
Americans, Europeans.
Yeah,
I
plenty
mean,
of people
we
do
talked
that.
about whether intervention is neo-colonialism in another form or whether it's welcome last year.
That can be, some people argue that there is two types of intervention. There's the hard intervention and the soft intervention. This is the kind of soft intervention. I mean,
but you're seeing a lot of it.
yeah, I mean, there is. I mean, plenty of organizations are working freely in Libya now, especially American, also the American, British, and also from Arab countries, and it depends on exactly what's the agenda they are serving. But on the long run, I see the thing is as a process. It needs to be taken step by step and see how it goes. So far now, I agree with Ahmed. We were discussing it yesterday. I mean, the election and the election outcome is not necessarily what we are looking for. We are looking for is the process itself to continue for the people to debate their rights on the streets, at the same time to have those rights exercised. It's not enough to have a lovely constitution that shrines all the rights and people don't know those rights, and then the government imposes a law that is unconstitutional, but people don't know that because they don't have any knowledge of it.
At which point, let me put to you a quotation for our last few minutes. It says, the regional psychological shift from victimhood and apathy to entitlement and self-empowerment is unstoppable. It's ended over 40 years of stagnation, and it's here to stay. Now, that's a quote from Amir, Sudanese thinker. And I just want a brief thought from each of you about, that's very optimistic. It's long-term, it's optimistic.
That's just demography. We cannot stop that. As Amir said very eloquently, this family structure is changing. One generation ago, every family used to have like 6 and 7 siblings and brothers and sisters. Now you have 2, 3 maximum. It's easier to rebel against the paternal authority when you are 2 than when you are 7. And it's easier to speak out, and it's easier in one word to see yourself as an individual. And there starts the conscience of individual rights, which is, by the way, the philosophical basis of democracy. Exactly. What we consider very quickly democracy is just a technical mechanism, putting the ballot in a box. This is not it. Democracy is a whole set of values, including individual rights, including individual freedoms, including freedom of thought, of conscience, of speech, and a whole set of values that are universal. And for these set of values to be really pushed, it takes a self-conscience of every citizen that I am an individual and I deserve individual rights. This is inevitable because the demography is changing and because the family structure is changing. These dictatorships can do nothing against it, so it's just a matter of time.
This is indisputable. It's biology. And again, the only big question mark, as I said many times, how will this manifest itself? Will it be, liberal, secular democracy, healthy, functioning? That, of course, there's no way we can know. But this is indisputable. Biology will change the face of the Arab world, full stop.
It doesn't mean immediately. Of course, we go through cycles of depression
at least a generation.
It takes a generation.
We're talking long term.
Of course. This is the long-term perspective. And the thing is, given me, why am I the ever-pragmatic optimist? Given enough time, things eventually get better.
I mean, even we were debating, throwing a dictatorship, toppling it might be quick, but might be painful. But building a real society, the society is the main important thing. Building it will be hard and long and might be also painful at the same time. And that is what we need to focus on. Continuing the course, continuing resistance, whatever it comes.
Maryam, you're seeing the hard and long and painful.
Well, I think I'm more pessimistic than my friends here, and I'm glad to see that they're optimistic. But I think that it's about time that here in the West, and I speak as an EU citizen, we realize that with democracy, that's how we combat terrorism. With democracy, that's how we combat extremism. And the West needs to get behind that. Right now, the West is standing on the wrong side of history when it comes to Bahrain and probably Syria as well. And what I would like to see is a change in that mindset, a change in the mindset that, we should support the authoritarian regimes no matter what the cost because of our economic and geopolitical interests. And I think it's very sad that today we have a prime minister for more than 40 years in Bahrain, and nobody in the West thinks that that's a problem. And the other thing is that we're still looking at a position where the government is striking down, beating people on the streets, and yet it's getting no attention internationally. And I think that really needs to change.
Lina, you are individually empowered. Is your society getting there?
Well, let me say that despite the gloomy picture I see now, I'm hopeful. I see the Tunisian society fighting for its rights, freedom. Despite all the violence and repression we are facing, people are still fighting. We can see changes, but these changes are in the Tunisians themselves. Tunisians and Arab citizens in general got rid of their fears, and they won't allow dictatorships to govern them again. And this is very important, and this is what gives us all hope and what drives us to fight.
And we
I
need
think
patience for that.
Yeah.
that's where we're going to leave it. I want to say, though, you can keep the debate going. You know where they are. They're here. If you're at the Oslo Freedom Forum, you can keep talking to us on Twitter with the hashtag OFF12, or go to the website oslofreedomforum.com. Thank you all so much for your insights.
Thank you.
Thank you.